Philosophers often talk about the extension or the intention of a concept, and also about extensionality, intentionality, and more recently, hyperintensionality. And the aim of this video is to explain those terms. So let's start with a concept. A concept is something that can be applied to an object, either correctly or incorrectly. And in natural language, a concept might, for instance, appear as a noun, as an adjective, or as a verb. Let's give an example of each. So dog, a noun, well, that's a concept, right? We can apply dog to various things. And if I apply dog to Rex, and I say Rex is a dog, I'm saying something that's true. Whereas if I apply dog to the Eiffel Tower, and I say the Eiffel Tower is a dog, I'm saying something that's false. Well, that's also true for an adjective like red, right? If I say the tomato is red, that might be true. The Eiffel Tower is red is false. There could also be a concept like owns, or the owning relation, we might say, which doesn't apply to single things, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that I own. I own? Yeah, I own what? So something like the concept of owning applies to a pair of things. In fact, an ordered pair of things. One thing that does the owning and one thing that is owned. So if I apply the concept of owning to the ordered pair of me and this Nietzsche bust, and I say, I own this Nietzsche bust, I'm saying something that's true. Whereas if I say that the Nietzsche bust owns me, or if I say that I own the Eiffel Tower, I'm saying something that is false. So, concepts, however they are expressed in natural language, are things that apply to single objects, or maybe to ordered pairs of objects, or to even larger structure of objects. And if they do apply, then it's correct to say of this object or this pair of objects or whatever that they fall under the concept. If they don't apply, it's incorrect. It's false to say of these things that they fall under the concept. So, having said that, we can now fairly easily say what the extension of a concept is. The extension of a concept is just all the things to which it applies, all the things that fall under it. So, taking the concept of dog, the extension of the concept of dog is just all the dogs, right? All the dogs that there are, that's the extension of the concept of dog. I'm not saying that there are no difficult questions here, right? One difficult question is whether dogs in the past and dogs in the future also are part of this extension. That's going to depend on our philosophy of time. I'm going to bracket those kinds of issues. So let's assume that we know whether to count the past and the future or just look at the present. Then the concept of dog has the extension all the dogs. The concept of red has as extension all the red things. The concept of ownership, owning, owns, has as an extension all the ordered pairs of objects such that the first object owns the second. Right? So the extension of ownership is Victor Gijsbers, the Nietzsche bust. Victor Gijsbers, this pen. And lots of other people standing in this relationship to lots of other things. So that's an extension. It's just a group of things to which a concept truthfully applies. The intention of a concept, on the other hand, is its meaning. Right? So the intention of a concept is its meaning. The intention of dog, well, it has something to do with being a mammal of a certain kind. I can't give you a perfect definition of dog, but you presumably know more or less what it means. And the same for red and ownership. The intention of that term is its meaning. Now, when we think about the relationship between intention and extension, what we can see is that two concepts with the same intention, so the same meaning, have the same extension. Right? Two concepts that just mean the exact same thing are going to apply truthfully to the exact same things. Right? So let's take owning again. Suppose that owning just means the same thing as possessing. right? I own the Nietzsche bust just means the same thing as I possess the Nietzsche bust. Well, if that's true, then the concept of owning and the concept of possessing have the exact same extension, right? They apply to the exact same things. And in fact, somebody might claim that they are the same concept, that we just use different words to express the same concept. But either way, same intention means same extension. The other way around, however, it's not the case that having the same extension means having the same intention. Or in other words, two concepts could apply to the same objects, to the exact same group of objects, but still have a different meaning. So let's take a simple example of that. The concept of being the tallest building in Paris, and the concept of being the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair, so being the tallest building in Paris and being the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair, those are concepts that clearly have different meanings, right? And so different intentions. Being the tallest building in Paris just doesn't mean the same thing as being the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair. Nevertheless, these two concepts have the same extension. They both apply truthfully to the same objects, namely to exactly one object, the Eiffel Tower. Right? So here we have two concepts that have the same extension, but they have different meanings or intentions. So that's what extension and intention means, and we can see how they are related. Same intention means same extension, but concepts with different intentions can have the same extension, right? So same extension does not mean same intention. Now, one thing that philosophers are often interested in is whether a certain way of thinking or a certain way of talking or a certain subject matter is extensional. And to say that something is extensional is basically to say that we only need to care about the extension of the concepts that we are using. And to make that a little bit more precise, this idea of only having to care about, to make that a little bit more precise, one thing that we are very often interested in is whether there is or not something that we can call extensional substitutability. And what I mean by that is that in certain contexts, in certain like subject matters for instance, whenever two concepts have the same extension, right? Whenever two concepts have the same extension, I can always switch one out for the other. So in certain contexts, I can always switch one thing out and put the other thing in. And so, for instance, let's suppose that I talk about weight. That's all I'm doing. I'm just talking about the weights of objects, right? Maybe that's an extensional use of language or an extensional context where I can always switch out concepts with the same extension. I don't have to worry about their intention. So if I say the tallest building in Paris weighs more than 1,000 kilograms, and that's true, and it is true, I can take out the tallest building in Paris, I can put in the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair, and I'm going to get a sentence that is still true, right? If the tallest building in Paris weighs more than 1,000 kilograms is true, then the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair weighs more than 1,000 kilograms is also true. And if one of these statements would be false, the other would be false too. If I'm just talking about weights, then all I need to care about is the extension of concepts, right? That might be true. Now, the reason that philosophers are interested in this idea of substitution and this idea of an extensional context is not that they want to talk about weights, for instance. There are actually several philosophical reasons for caring about this. So one reason is that standard logic, I won't go into sort of the reasons why, but standard logic handles these extensional contexts very well. In standard logic, what we tend to do is we tend to run over objects and check whether something works for them or is true for them. And if we are able, right, to just only care about extension, then a lot of logical reasoning can be done that can't be done if we have to also care about intention. So standard logic is much more applicable, it's a much more powerful tool if we manage to confine ourselves to contexts where extensionally equivalent concepts can be substituted while keeping the same truth values. So that's one reason to care about that. Another reason to care about that is that many philosophers have thought that extensions are very clear and intensions are not. Right? When I think about dog, and I just think about, oh look, I mean there's a class of objects, namely all the dogs, and that's the extension of the term, well that seems perfectly definite, right? I mean it's just a bunch of objects, we know what that is. If I think about the meaning of the term dog, what's a meaning? How does meaning work? How do I establish meaning? How do I know whether two terms really have the same meaning? I mean, those seem to be much more difficult questions philosophically. And so it might seem that we are in a realm of much clearer thought, and maybe a realm where we can do better philosophy if we manage to confine ourselves to just thinking about extensions and not caring about differences in intention. Finally, one of the places where people really started to use this modern logic, and one of the subjects that a lot of analytic philosophers have really cared about, is mathematics. And mathematics is basically always only interested in the extension of terms. So mathematics, this like very interesting, complex and powerful realm of thinking, seems to be a realm where we only have to care about extensions, right? If it is true that, let's say, being a number that is divisible by 10 and being a number that is divisible by 2 and 5 have the same extension, and they have the same extension, we can just plug in one or the other, it doesn't matter, in all of mathematics, right? We can forget about intentions and just talk about extensions only in mathematics. So that's nice. However, philosophers, tend to find themselves in situations where talking and caring only about extensions doesn't work. And I'm going to give you two examples of contexts where intention seems to matter, where you cannot just switch or interchange concepts with the same extension. One example is knowledge. So suppose that I say, I know that the tallest building in Paris is the tallest building in Paris. Yeah, I mean, I know that, and you know that, and you knew that before watching this video. That doesn't mean that we can take out one of these instances of the tallest building in Paris and put in the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair exhibition, because maybe you did not know that the tallest building in Paris is the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair exhibition, right? I mean, you certainly knew that the tallest building in Paris is the tallest building in Paris, but it's very possible that you did not know that the tallest building in Paris is the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair exhibition. So you cannot, when you talk about knowledge, for instance, or belief, or really anything else that has to do with my mental attitude towards something, you can't believe you can't hold that their extension is the only thing that matters. Clearly, intention matters as well. The same is true when we're not thinking about something like a mental attitude or a belief or knowledge, but when we're thinking about what philosophers call modality, when we're thinking about what is necessary, what is possible. So, using the same example, we could say, look, necessarily, the tallest building in Paris is the tallest building in Paris. And that seems right. I mean, that's necessary. It couldn't be otherwise. Right? It couldn't be the case that the tallest building in Paris is not the tallest building in Paris. But there doesn't seem to be anything necessary about the tallest building in Paris being the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair. Right? I mean, it seems perfectly false to say necessarily the tallest building in Paris is the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair, because, people could have built a taller building in Paris and that it would no longer have been true. So, when we think about something like knowledge or when we think about something like necessity, we can't just look at the extensions of concepts, we also have to look at their meanings or intentions. And so that's what philosophers have been doing. But, of course, if philosophers have reasons to like situations where they only have to think about extensions, perhaps because it works better with the tools of formal logic, for instance, or because they think that it's clearer, then philosophers are going to look for a way to treat intentions as extensions. And that's exactly what has been done for decades now in standard possible worlds semantics. Okay, let's think about that. Standard possible worlds semantics. What's that? Well, we don't have to look at all the details, but here is one way to think about it. Suppose that you conceive of not just our world, but let's say all the possible worlds, right? Where we can sort of think of that as, any way that you could conceive a world to be, that's a possible world. So there's a possible world that is just like ours, except that this Nietzsche bust was painted in a garish pink color. That's a possible world where I therefore have a slightly worse taste than I actually have. And there are other possible worlds which are much more different from ours. Now, what philosophers have tried to do is they have tried to say, look, maybe the intention of a term, of a concept, is completely captured by its extension, not in the real world, because we know that two terms with different meanings can have the same extension in the real world, right? They can be true about the same things in the real world. But maybe the intention of a term is its extension in all the possible worlds. And so we can see that the tallest building in Paris and the centerpiece of the 1889 World Fair have a different intention. Because although they have the same extension in the real world, they're both true about the Eiffel Tower, there are other possible worlds where they have different extensions. Right? There are other possible worlds where the tallest building in Paris is, let's say, a skyscraper built in 1956. That's another possible world, and there the term the tallest building in Paris and the term the central exhibit of the 1889 World Fair do not have the same extension. So if we look at the extension across all the possible worlds, we can distinguish between these different intentions. And now, of course, it turns out that if that's how we understand intention, so we look at the extension across all the possible worlds, then if two terms have the same extension, not just in our world, but in all the possible worlds, we can actually start switching them, right? We can actually substitute one for the other in sentences that have to do with necessity and possibility and so on. And so what this move towards possible worlds, what it does is it takes intention, it turns it into a kind of extension, and it makes sure that extensionality, so only having to care about extensions, becomes true for an important part of philosophy, namely modal claims, right? Claims about what is necessary and what is possible and so on. So this is something that is extremely popular. Treating meanings or intentions as extension across possible worlds, extremely popular move, and it allows you to sort of use extensional ways of thinking in modal contexts. However, it turns out that even these concepts that have the same extension across all possible worlds cannot always be substituted one for the other. So there are concepts that have the exact same extension, not just in the real world, but in every possible world, and yet you cannot always substitute one for the other. And that phenomenon is nowadays called hyperintensionality. So again, let's make that clearer with an example. So let's take the following two phrases. The 100th prime number, and 541. I'm going to tell you that 541 is the 100th prime number. So these two phrases, the 100th prime number and 541, have the same extension. They're true about the number 541. And they have the same extension in every possible world, right? In all the possible worlds, the prime numbers are the same, right? It's not possible that the prime numbers are different from what they actually are. It's not the case that there's a possible world where 4 is a prime number, right? I mean, that's can't happen, right? It's impossible. So, in every possible world, the extension of 541 and the 100th prime number are the same. But that doesn't mean that I can always exchange one for the other and keep my sentences true. Because while it is certainly the case that I know that the 100th prime number is the 100th prime number, it doesn't follow that I know that the 100th prime number is 541. And before doing my research for this video, I didn't know that the 100th prime number is 541. So it seems clear that there are situations where we cannot treat two concepts as equivalent, even if their extension in all possible worlds is the same. And so, as I said, this is now called hyperintensionality in philosophy. I'm tempted to say that it is actually just kind of intentionality, and that it shows that there was something wrong with the move of trying to understand meaning in terms of extension across all possible worlds, but that's my interpretation. That's not an interpretation that philosophers in general share. What we see in philosophy nowadays is that a lot of people are interested in hyperintentionality, and they're trying to understand how we have to think about concepts in order to do justice to that. And so, in other words, what we're seeing is that a lot of people are starting to become convinced, or have already become convinced, that there are limits to the extensional treatment of concepts, even if we look at all the possible worlds.